When people think of German air power in World War II, fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 often steal the spotlight. But behind every major German campaign stood a complex bomber force. As we go, note which bomber you think best represented German air power at its peak, or which one surprised you the most. Early war. Light and dive bombers, 1936-1941, Junkers Ju-87, Stuka. The Ju-87 was the most recognizable German bomber of the early war, designed specifically for precision dive bombing. Entering service before WWII, it became the spearhead of blitzkrieg operations in Poland, Norway, France, and the Low Countries. Its ability to dive almost vertically allowed German pilots to hit bridges, bunkers, and troop concentrations with frightening accuracy. However, this precision came at a cost. The Stuka was slow, lightly armed, and completely dependent on air superiority. Once enemy fighters appeared in strength, most notably during the Battle of Britain, the Ju-87 suffered catastrophic losses and was withdrawn from frontline operations in the West, though it remained effective on the Eastern Front where air opposition was weaker. Henschel HS-123. Often overlooked, the HS-123 was an older biplane dive bomber that predated most Luftwaffe designs. Despite its outdated appearance, it proved surprisingly rugged and reliable. During the early campaigns and later on the Eastern Front, the HS-123 excelled in close air support roles, operating from rough forward airstrips and surviving heavy ground fire. Its simple construction made it easy to maintain, and pilots valued its responsiveness at low altitude. While obsolete by technical standards, it remained in service far longer than expected due to sheer effectiveness in ground attack missions. Heinkel He-50. The He-50 was one of Germany's earliest purpose-built dive bombers and served as an important developmental step rather than a frontline war winner. By the outbreak of WWII, it was already outdated and largely relegated to training and secondary roles. Its significance lies in helping establish dive bombing tactics and pilot training methods that later aircraft, particularly the Ju-87, would refine and dominate with. Arado R-65. Originally designed as a fighter, limited R-65 variants were adapted for light bombing and ground attack duties during the Luftwaffe's early expansion. By the time large-scale combat began, these aircraft were rapidly phased out, replaced by more specialized bombers. Their brief service highlights how quickly German bomber doctrine evolved in the years leading up to war. Standard medium bombers, backbone of the Luftwaffe, 1937-1943, Heinkel, a 111. The He-111 became the most important German bomber of the early and mid-war years, forming the backbone of Luftwaffe bombing operations. Originally disguised as a civilian transport to bypass treaty restrictions, it evolved into a versatile medium bomber capable of carrying substantial bomb loads over long distances. The He-111 was used extensively in Poland, France, the Battle of Britain, and later across the vast expanses of the Eastern Front. While it was reliable and adaptable, its defensive armament proved increasingly inadequate as Allied fighter opposition improved. By 1943, the aircraft was clearly outclassed, yet it remained in service due to the lack of a true replacement. Dornier Du-17. Nicknamed the Flying Pencil because of its narrow fuselage, the Du-17 was designed for speed rather than payload. Early in the war, this approach proved effective, allowing the aircraft to evade enemy fighters through sheer speed. It played a key role during the invasion of Poland and the early phases of the Battle of Britain. However, as fighter speeds increased and defensive firepower became more important, the Du-17's limited bomb load and cramped design became serious drawbacks. It was gradually phased out of frontline bomber units by 1942. Dornier Du-215. The Du-215 was an improved derivative of the Du-17, incorporating more powerful engines and refined systems. Though produced in smaller numbers, it served in bombing, reconnaissance, and night attack roles. Its limited production reflected Germany's shift toward more versatile designs like the Ju-88, which could perform multiple roles more effectively. The Du-215 service illustrates the Luftwaffe's transitional period, where incremental improvements struggled to keep pace with rapidly evolving air combat demands. Junkers Ju-88. The Ju-88 was arguably the most versatile aircraft in the German bomber force. Designed as a fast medium bomber, It evolved into a true multi-role platform, serving as a bomber, dive bomber, night fighter, reconnaissance aircraft, and torpedo bomber. Its speed and adaptability allowed it to remain relevant longer than most German bombers. However, constant modifications increased weight and complexity, gradually eroding its original performance advantages. Even so, the Ju-88 became the workhorse of the Luftwaffe, filling gaps left by failed or delayed replacement programs. Advanced and heavy bomber attempts, 1939–1944, Heinkel Ho 177 Greif. The He-177 was Germany's only serious attempt to field a true heavy bomber during WWII, and it stands as one of the most troubled aircraft programs of the war. Intended to give the Luftwaffe long-range striking power, it was burdened from the start by conflicting requirements, most notably the demand that it retain dive bombing capability, something entirely unsuited to a heavy bomber. To meet performance goals, engineers paired engines together in shared nacelles, creating extreme overheating problems. Fires became so common that crews nicknamed it the Luftwaffe lighter. Although later versions improved reliability and payload capacity, the He-177 never reached the production scale or operational effectiveness Germany needed. By the time it became marginally usable, Allied air superiority and bombing pressure made sustained heavy bomber operations impossible. Heinkel He-274. The 274 was an attempt to correct the fundamental flaws of the He-177 by abandoning the dive bombing requirement and focusing on high-altitude performance and long-range capability. Designed with separate engines and a pressurized cabin, it represented a more realistic heavy bomber concept. However, production delays and shifting priorities meant it never entered Luftwaffe service. Completed airframes were captured and later tested by the French after the war, underscoring how late Germany's heavy bomber solutions arrived. Junkers Ju-89. Although it never saw combat in WWII, the Ju-89 deserves mention because it influenced German bomber doctrine, or rather, its absence. Developed in the mid-1930s as part of an early heavy bomber program, it demonstrated promising range and payload capacity. However, German leadership abandoned the concept in favor of medium bombers believed to be more suitable for fast, decisive wars. The cancellation of the Ju-89 effectively sealed Germany's reliance on medium bombers, a decision that would later limit strategic bombing options against distant targets. Maritime, torpedo, and anti-shipping bombers, 1940–1944, Heinkel He-115. The He-115 was a twin-engine floatplane bomber developed specifically for maritime warfare. Entering service just before the war, it was used for torpedo attacks, mine-laying, and reconnaissance over the North Sea, Baltic, and Arctic waters. Its ability to operate from coastal bases and sheltered harbors gave Germany early flexibility in naval air operations. However, the aircraft was slow and lightly defended, making it increasingly vulnerable as Allied fighter coverage expanded. By 1942, losses mounted, and the He-115 was gradually withdrawn from frontline roles, replaced by land-based bombers better suited to contested airspace. Junkers Ju-88A-17, torpedo variant. As Germany's naval war intensified, the Ju-88 was adapted into a dedicated torpedo bomber. The A-17 variant carried one or two aerial torpedoes and became a major threat to Allied shipping, particularly in the Mediterranean and Arctic convoy routes. Its speed and relatively low-level attack profile made interception difficult, and Ju-88 torpedo units achieved notable success against merchant vessels and warships alike. However, torpedo supply shortages and increasing Allied air defenses limited sustained effectiveness. Even so, the Ju-88A-17 demonstrated how adaptable medium bombers could partially compensate for the Luftwaffe's lack of specialized naval aircraft. Focke-Wulf 200 Condor, originally designed as a long-range civilian airliner, the FW200 was hastily converted into a maritime patrol bomber at the outbreak of war. Operating over the Atlantic, it earned a reputation as the Scourge of the Atlantic by shadowing convoys and directing U-boats to their targets, while also conducting direct bombing attacks. Its long range gave Germany a rare strategic reconnaissance capability, but structural weaknesses plagued the design. The airframe was never intended for combat stress, and accidents were frequent. As Allied escorts improved and long-range fighters appeared, the Condor's survivability declined sharply, forcing it into secondary roles by mid-war. Late war specialized in fast bombers, 1943–1945, Junkers. Ju-188. The Ju-188 was developed as an evolutionary improvement over the Ju-88, addressing the growing performance gap between German bombers and Allied defenses. It featured more powerful engines, improved aerodynamics, and a redesigned cockpit with better visibility. Entering service in 1943, the Ju-188 was intended to restore some degree of survivability through speed and altitude rather than armor. It served in conventional bombing, reconnaissance, and maritime strike roles, but persistent engine shortages and Allied air superiority prevented it from being deployed in the numbers originally planned. While technically superior to earlier models, it arrived too late to alter the Luftwaffe's declining bombing capability. Junkers Ju-388. The Ju-388 represented Germany's push toward high-altitude bombing and reconnaissance as lower-flying aircraft became increasingly vulnerable. Equipped with turbocharged engines and, in some versions, a pressurized cabin, it was designed to operate above the effective reach of many Allied fighters and anti-aircraft guns. Only small numbers were produced and operational use was limited, but the aircraft reflected a clear shift in German bomber thinking, prioritizing altitude and survivability over mass formations. By late 1944, however, fuel shortages and Allied radar-directed interception made even high-altitude operations hazardous. Arado R-234. The R-234 holds a unique place in aviation history as the world's first operational jet bomber. Powered by turbojet engines, it was capable of speeds far beyond those of piston engine fighters, making interception extremely difficult. Initially used for reconnaissance, it was later adapted to carry bombs, conducting fast, precision strikes against high-value targets. Despite its technological advantage, the R-234's impact was limited by small production numbers, short range, and Germany's collapsing industrial base. It symbolized both the remarkable innovation and the strategic desperation of the Luftwaffe in the final phase of the war. Experimental, limited service and conversion bombers, 1939-1945, Messerschmitt Me-410. Hornisse. The Me-410 was developed as a heavy fighter, but it was also used in bomber and strike roles as the Luftwaffe searched for multi-purpose solutions. Carrying bombs internally or externally, it was intended to attack high-value targets, such as bomber formations, rail yards, and infrastructure. Early on, its speed and heavy armament made it dangerous, but Allied escort fighters quickly neutralized this advantage. As losses increased, the Me-410's bomber role became increasingly limited, highlighting how conversion designs struggled when faced with sustained air superiority by the enemy. Messerschmitt Me-262A2A. The Me-262 is best known as the world's first operational jet fighter, but the A2A variant was adapted for bombing missions. Carrying two bombs under the nose, it was used for fast strike attacks against bridges, airfields, and troop concentrations. Its jet speed allowed it to penetrate defended airspace with minimal warning, but accuracy suffered due to high attack speeds and limited training. Fuel shortages, maintenance complexity, and Hitler's insistence on bomber use delayed its effective deployment. As a bomber, the Me-262 showed promise but remained more symbol than solution. Heinkel He-219. Primarily designed as a night fighter, the He-219 also undertook limited strike and bombing missions, particularly against ground targets and bombers on the ground. Its advanced radar and heavy armament made it formidable at night, but its use as a bomber was always secondary. Production delays and political infighting restricted its numbers, preventing broader operational experimentation. The He-219 illustrates how late-war German aircraft often carried overlapping roles, driven more by necessity than coherent strategy. By the end of World War II, Germany's bomber force told a clear story, not of a lack of innovation, but of strategic miscalculation and shifting priorities. Early success with dive bombers and fast medium bombers reinforced the belief that wars could be won quickly through precision and shock. That assumption shaped every bomber decision the Luftwaffe made. As the war expanded geographically and industrial targets moved farther away, the absence of a true, reliable heavy bomber became impossible to ignore. Attempts to correct this came too late. tangled in technical compromises and political interference. Even Germany's most advanced late-war bombers, including jet-powered designs, were constrained by fuel shortages, pilot attrition, and overwhelming Allied air superiority. In the end, German bombers were often technically impressive, but strategically mismatched to the kind of total long-duration war they were forced to fight. Looking back across this full inventory, the question remains whether any single bomber could have changed that outcome, or whether the real limitation was the doctrine guiding their use from the very beginning.